Dune Part 2 was released over the weekend, and it takes place directly after Part 1, in which Paul Atreides and his mother, Lady Jessica, are stuck in the desert with the Freemen after the Harkonnens destroyed the entire Atreides house. And so Paul Atreides, he learns the ways of the Freemen while also fulfilling a prophecy that he is the Messiah that will lead them in taking back Arrakis, and Paul taking revenge against the other house that killed his entire family. Now, if you've seen my review of the first Dune, you know how I feel about it. It was one of my favorite films of 2021, and so I was naturally excited for part 2, but this film got pushed back because of all the strikes, which was a good move on Warner Brothers' part. But in retrospect, I think this franchise is just destined to have a delayed release because the first film was delayed because of COVID, and now this film was delayed because of the strikes. But Dune as a whole, I never read the book. I do own the book, which you can see behind me right here. And while I love the film on first watch, I love it more and more upon multiple rewatches. I love the characters, I love the lore, and I just love the whole scope of this entire story that it's trying to tell. And essentially, part 2 is the second half of the first book. Now, how did I feel about this film after seeing it? I really enjoyed it. This film definitely lived up to the hype. Not only did I enjoy the experience, but I loved the story progression. Denis Villeneuve, he definitely put his foot into the first film, and he more than put his foot into this second film. The visuals are just as, if not better than the first film. Like, there's particularly scenes in this film that are in black and white, and I was just mesmerized. Though I will say the first half of this story was a bit slow at first. It wasn't too slow. It just took a while to really get going. But once it does get going, it really got going and just didn't stop. But you gotta think, this is part 2 of a larger story, so they had to massage us in before they really start getting going. And plus, that first part was really the development of Paul Atreides, his goal, and the development of Paul Atreides and Chani, which I will get into in a little bit. But I also just love the themes that this story continues from part 1, in which there is a lot of scheming going on between all the houses, and particularly the Emperor. The themes of religion, in which people have these theories and they believe these prophecies, but then you also get some people like Chani who just doesn't believe. And then you also have people that are basically lying to the people and manipulating people into believing these different types of religion. And of course, with the scheming, it is also a war of power. People trying to stay in power and people just trying to rule over people. Now, Timothée Chalamet once again plays Paul Atreides, and I loved his arc in this film because in the first part, it was basically, you got to think, he was basically the prince of this entire house, and then they get sent to another planet, and then his entire house and his family, particularly his father, all that gets taken away from him, and now he's just in a position where he got to pick himself up and pick up the pieces. And he really does become the savior of the Freemen. I just love how he has to learn the ways of the Freemen, and he is just humble. And that's one thing that Javier Bardem's character loves, is that he's humble, which leads him to believe like he really is truly the Messiah. Timothée Chalamet, he really put his foot into his performance here, and you really believe that, because like in the first part, yeah, he was believable as just this timid teenager, but then you don't know if he can become what this part of the story requires of him, and this movie definitely proves that. But of course, and this is a slight spoiler, but one of my favorite parts in this movie was when he rides the sandworm, and I'm telling you, this is worth watching on a big screen. Whether it's IMAX or just an amplified theater experience, watch this on the big screen possible, because the sandworm scene, when I was watching that, I was like, to quote Martin Scorsese, that is cinema. Now, Chani is played by Zendaya, in which she didn't have too much to do in the first film, but they make up for it in this film. And as I said before, they develop the relationship between her and Paul, and she's not really a believer, but I just love how she likes Paul the person, but not Paul the Messiah. And that definitely plays a part throughout the movie, and particularly the ending. And Zendaya, she really put in work for this performance. Lady Jessica is played once again by Rebecca Ferguson, the mother of Paul Atreides, and she definitely went to a place in this film that I did not expect. Javier Bardem returns as Stilgar, and he's one of the few believers of Paul Atreides and believing that he's a messiah, but also he adds a bit of comic relief to the movie. Like, he's one of the few characters in this movie that has personality, because, spoiler alert, Jason Momoa's character, Duncan Idaho, he got killed in the first film, and Josh Brolin, he only had but so much screen time in this film. But like I said, Josh Brolin, he returns, and his role is more extended in here than it was in part one. And I just love the relationship he has with Paul Atreides because he's one of the few people outside of the Freeman that knows him and knows what Paul is capable of, and he's just there for encouragement and helping him and the Freeman take back Arrakis. The Harkonnens definitely have a bigger role to play, though you don't get too much from Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, who's played by Stellan Skarsgård. And this is where I say the themes of power come in because, he took back Arrakis, he wiped out the Atreides at the behest of the Emperor. But now the Freemen, they're just cleaning house and taking names. And half of it is Dave Bautista's fault, who is the nephew of the Baron Harkonnen in this film. And yeah, I like Dave Bautista's character in this film more than I did in this film because it feels like there's actual stakes to his character because he just keeps fucking up. But the true standout of the Harkonnens is Austin Butler's Thade, who was originally played by Sting in the 1980 movie, but here he's played by Austin Butler, hot off of Elvis. And I was curious to see what he will bring to this role because his character in the books is a bit of a psychopath, and he definitely proves that here. Like, he is silent, but he's also just calm and collected, and you just believe that he will take you out at a moment's notice for no reason. I like Austin Butler in this movie more than I did in Elvis, to be honest, because it's kind of a bit out of his element. Speaking of more of the newer characters, you have the Emperor, who is played by Christopher Walken, which, when I heard about that, I was like, one, I haven't seen Christopher Walken in anything in the last couple of years, and two, Christopher Walken as the Emperor, that is interesting, but it just might work. Now, granted, temper your expectations because Christopher Walken's character, he is only in the movie but for so much, and he's clearly there just to set up a possible sequel after this movie. And I can definitely say the same about Princess Irulan, who is played by Florence Pugh. That character was originally played by Virginia Madsen in the 1984 film. And just like Christopher Walken, she only has but so much screen time, and she's just here just to serve the plot and also set up the third movie. I was really looking forward to Hans Zimmer's score in this movie, and he did not disappoint. This is just as good as the soundtrack for the first movie. Aside from the newer characters you see in this movie really does do a lot to set up a third film, but it also doesn't detract from the story that it's still trying to tell. Because like I said, this second part is the second half of the first book, so it wraps up a lot of things that were set up in the first part, but also gives us some new things that'll become relevant in the third movie if it ever happens. Now, there are some people there saying, like, you gotta watch part one in order to understand part two, and then there are some people that say you don't necessarily have to watch part one to enjoy part two, and I feel like it kind of goes both ways. I mean, I feel like if you're one of those people that really didn't vibe with the first movie, part two is definitely for you. You don't necessarily have to watch part one to enjoy part two. Part two is the movie for you. But if you did enjoy part one, then yeah, it's definitely essential to watch part one in order to understand everything that happened in part two, because everything that happens in part two happened because of part one. But me personally, I cannot wait for part two to come out on Blu-ray so I can watch both films back to back. It really, whenever a movie does like a part one, part two, I just love watching them back to back just to get the full experience. But like I said, this movie definitely lived up to the hype. I highly recommend it, and I definitely recommend you watch this on the biggest screen possible, whether it's in IMAX. I ended up not going to an IMAX screening, but I went to a different theater that has basically their own answer to IMAX. It was an amplified screening experience, and it still worked. It's without a doubt one of my favorites of the year so far. I'm going to give Dune Part 2 the hard eyes emoji.